Depending on what your data plan is, sometimes it's easier to listen on YouTube. Just pops right up. It's just optimized out the wazoo for everything. So it's just super easy to, like, Sports Radio 610 always pops up on my YouTube feed first.
Me too.
And I'm like, swipe away from that crap. I've had enough. I've had enough for one day.
4 hours is enough. We're on YouTube and Twitch for those who don't know. It's been fun. It's building, man. Building for sure. The good folks at Pro Football Focus have a bounce back candidate for each of the 32 teams, and it's nice for the Texans that if you try to put a list together, it's hard to get a super long list of bounce back candidates because a lot of guys had good years last year.
Right.
A vast majority of the players who were here prior to DeMeco Ryans showed further development as players as opposed to regressing as players. Now, the one that Pro Football Focus identifies as the bounce-back player for the Texans actually was not a Houston Texan last year. And yet I don't like hearing about the need for a bounce-back from this particular player because while the Texans didn't invest much to get this player, they are investing a decent chunk of change to keep this player, and it's Joe Mixon, who they only gave up a 7th-round pick to get, which is awesome. And I like Mixon, and Mixon, with the caveat that it's OTAs, I'll say this, Mixon looks to be in great shape out at OTAs.
Right. Nah, don't, Sean, I didn't mean to try to, deaden your excitement or anything for the guys you saw out at OTAs. It's good. It's good when you see guys moving athletically.
Yeah. No, I deadened my own by hearing the David Johnson analysis I gave a few years ago. Resonated. But anyways, Mixon, this is why I bring up Mixon. This is what PFF says. Mixon is almost 28 and approaching the point of no return in running back age and production, but I'm willing to expect better play from him in 2024. Mixon's yards after contact per carry dropped marginally from 2022 to 23, and his elusiveness rating was actually 7.7 points higher. Well, that actually sounds pretty good.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like, the way they described it doesn't sound like he needs to have a bounce back.
Major bounce back or anything,
about the same. Yeah, I think if you look at overall production, I mean, in a lot of ways, he had 1,034 yards rushing last year. That was better than the year before. Not as good as the years where he was at 1,100 or so. His yards per attempt was 4 yards per attempt, which is better than the previous year, but not as good as, the second year in the league, he had like 4.9 yards per attempt. This is the biggest thing about Joe Mixon that you need to understand. It was what they referenced there in that write-up. He is, I'll say, only 28 years old. I think I have to remind myself that sometimes because it feels like he's been around forever. I think there's a tendency to feel like, oh yeah, he's one of these 30-year-olds, but he's 28's not super old yet, but it is that age at which a lot of running backs these days seem to fall off. The biggest thing to remember, other than him not being that old, is that last year the Bengals as an offense moved away from a lot of the stuff that Joe Mixon is best at, either because of Joe Burrow's preferences or because he was injured. And let's remember, too, that Joe Burrow was injured 2/3 of the way through the season.
Yes.
But even when Joe Burrow was healthy, they were in gun a lot. Like, Joe Burrow was in the top percentages of guys out of the gun, like how often they run out of the gun. And Joe Mixon is a guy who is at his best when the quarterback is under center and he can get a head of steam and hit the hole hard. They didn't do a whole lot of that. Like, I'm not an old man that thinks that you shouldn't be running out of gun ever. Like, you can do really well running out of the gun. I think there's a limit to like how much you can do out of the shotgun. But I think that with Houston, he's going to be in a system and a play calling strategy that's a lot more like your classic Kyle Shanahan system, where you've got the quarterback under center a lot, and Joe Mixon can hit the hole super, super hard. And I think you do say, whether it's bounce back or not, I don't think you have to worry about a drop off. I think like with them, they're almost acting like it's not as much of a bounce back, but like staving off other time longer than a lot of guys do these days.
Well, and it sounds crazy to say this because we're comparing it to the offense in Cincinnati, which has Joe Burrow at quarterback when he's healthy, and Jamar Chase and T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd. had all those guys. But the PFF, they point out, he should face more light boxes in before, given the Texans' deadly aerial attack with Stroud, Nico Collins, Diggs, and Tank Dell.
Yeah, every time I've seen somebody make that comment in an article, I see 29 comments from Bengals fans being like, hey, he faced plenty of light boxes, in Cincinnati. And they're not even trying to they're not even trying to throw shade at Joe Mixon necessarily. It's just, I don't buy this write-up. I think this dude mailed it in on his write-up.
Okay.
Joe Mixon.
Okay.
I'd be okay with him saying, I like that he's saying that he'll be a bounce-back candidate. But I do think a lot of that's going to be based not on anything physically with Joe Mixon. It's just going to be a better mix of scheme and his skill.
Well, names I was expecting to see for the Texans in this article, okay, the names would have been any of these four names. Jalen Petrie, Dameon Pierce, Kenyon Green, Titus Howard. I would have expected those would have been. I would have bet my bottom dollar that it would have been one of those four names because those are guys who were actually on the Texans last year. I didn't expect to see Mixon, and B, those are guys that for various reasons, either because of injury or underperformance, or in the case of Titus Howard, both, they had bad years last year.
I think as far as bounce back goes, with Titus Howard, it's as simple as does he get to play right tackle?
Yeah.
He's just simply not a good guard, and I think hopefully God blessedly, they've realized that at this point. Now, I mean, he was forced into playing left guard last year because they had injury after injury after injury. If you look at the Texans' injuries as a total last year, they set a record for as long as they've been keeping track of this. The games lost to starters or starters, like games that where your designated starter wasn't playing, they set a record for it. They led the league by a wide margin in number of starter games lost to injury. The offensive line was one of the biggest offenders in that regard. It started 7 different offensive line combinations during the season. Mm-hmm. Never had a stretch of more than 4 games where you had all the same starters starting on the offensive line. It was really, really tough in the first year of an offense to have that continuity. So, yeah, I think Titus Howard will have a bounce back, A, by moving back to his natural position, and B, just by having, been in the system and seen and watched in film room after he was injured, all of that.
He's the one, somebody asked this question on the Utopia mailbag episode I did last week, and they didn't put Kenyon in there. They just had Petrie, Pierce, and Titus, and they may have had Kenyon in there, but they asked which was the most likely for a bounce back, and I picked Titus also because he's the one where it's least about actual performance of what he was doing last season.
Yeah.
Like, just be healthy and play right tackle, and by definition, you're going to be way better than what you were last year.
Yeah, it's been a weird dynamic because I end up having conversations with people a lot where either because they don't consciously think about it or they didn't realize it at least, they don't realize that Titus Howard didn't play right tackle at all last year.
Yeah.
And like somehow George Fant, supplanted him as a starter or something. And when people from outside of Houston, like people that cover the entire league, talk about it, they talk about it almost like Titus Howard was demoted to left guard, where it really wasn't that. I mean, I understand what Nick's strategy was, which was, all right, let's get the best athletes and the best players out there, and we're running out of options at left guard anyway. It just wasn't, it was more complicated than that.
Yeah, well, I mean, because you're right. It begs the question, like, he's so bad at it, why are you playing him there? Well, the first 3, you would have played any of these 3 guys ahead of Titus Howard at left guard. You would have played Kendrick Green ahead of him. You would have played Jarrett Patterson ahead of him. And obviously, if Kenyon Green is healthy, or were healthy to start the season, then he would have been in there too. I'm not saying that Kenyon Green necessarily would have been better, but ultimately, if he's banged up. But, yeah, I guess the other thing too, this isn't a bounce-back thing. This is just something that popped into my head that nobody's really made a big deal out of, I guess. But Juice Scruggs is absolutely the number 1 center on this team. Like, there's no mystery about that now. Like, he's been the number 1 center at all the OTAs so far.
I guess I would say maybe it's his position to lose, but I think there'll be actual competition.
He ain't playing left guard. He ain't playing left guard anymore. Is my point.
Right.
He's a center now.
Yeah. And at left guard, he was atrocious. Yeah. But I think he's another guy that, just like some tackles, it's not as simple as moving them down to guard. And hey, they'll be awesome. There's some guys who are strictly centers more so than guards. I think that Juice Scruggs is much more just of a natural center.
Yep. All right, Payne and Pendergast.